China didn't announce a victory. No headline meant to scare you. The number just appeared in a spreadsheet this week. One line, easy to miss, showing China has sold the world over $1 trillion more goods than it bought this year alone. That number is bigger than the entire economy of most countries. It didn't come from a boom. It didn't come from a bubble. It came while China's economy was slowing. And that's the part that doesn't fit, because trade surpluses usually shrink when growth slows. They don't quietly explode. Tariffs were supposed to stop this. Global decoupling was supposed to stop this. Yet the surplus kept growing, rerouted, reclassified, reabsorbed by a system that didn't push back. Nothing broke, nothing snapped, but the global economy adjusted around it, and most people never noticed. What makes it destabilizing is the speed. In 2004, China's surplus was roughly $50 billion. 2 decades later, it is more than 20 times larger. And even that figure may be too low. Brad Setzer, an economist at the Council on Foreign Relations, who reconciles Chinese export data with partner country import records, has argued that the true surplus is likely closer to $1.2 trillion. A surplus of that scale means the rest of the world is absorbing Chinese production at a pace never seen before, financing it through deficits, capital inflows, and balance sheet adjustments that quietly reshape the global economy. 2 questions determine how this happened. Why does China export so much, and why does it import so much less than it exports? The first answer begins with size. China's economy has expanded from well under $1 trillion in the late 1990s to roughly $18 trillion today, according to World Bank and IMF data, after decades of growth averaging close to 9% annually. When an economy of that magnitude runs even a modest surplus relative to output, the absolute number becomes overwhelming. This often leads to a misunderstanding. China's surplus is frequently described as uniquely distorted. Measured against GDP, it is not. China's trade surplus peaked around 10% of GDP in 2007. Over the past decade, it has averaged closer to 3% according to World Bank figures. That is higher than the global average, but below countries such as Japan, which has averaged around 4%, and Germany, which has often run surpluses near 7% of GDP. Proportions lose their calming effect once scale enters the picture. 3% of China's economy is not comparable to 3% of anyone else's. Scale still does not explain dominance. Competitiveness does. Chinese industry is not just large, it is exceptionally productive. A recent study examining industries where output can be measured in physical units found that Chinese manufacturing workers produce 2 to 3 times as much output per worker as their American counterparts, while earning wages roughly 80% lower. The gap reflects Chinese factory workers operating machinery, side-by-side comparison of Chinese and American factory floors, automation, logistics efficiency, dense supplier networks, and aggressive capital investment. The effect shows up clearly in trade data. China now accounts for roughly 20% of all manufacturing exports worldwide. When China joined the World Trade Organization in 2001, that share was closer to 5%. Germany, the second largest exporter, ships less than half of China's total. Richard Baldwin, an economist at the Center for Economic Policy Research, estimates that China now produces roughly 35% of total global manufacturing output, about the same as the next 10 manufacturing nations combined. No modern economy has ever occupied that position. Trade geography has adjusted. China is now the largest source of imported goods for roughly 2/3 of countries worldwide, including most of Africa, much of South America, and large parts of Southeast Asia. In many markets, Chinese suppliers are no longer optional. They are foundational. Export growth has also shifted up the value chain. Over the past year, shipments of media, electric vehicles on assembly line, batteries being manufactured, solar panels and advanced electronics packed for export, electric vehicles, batteries, solar equipment, and advanced electronics have expanded rapidly. These are sectors embedded in long-term industrial strategies and energy transitions, not easily displaced by price swings or short-term policy moves. That explains the export side. The second question is more contentious. Export earnings should translate into higher domestic spending and higher imports. That adjustment has not fully materialized. Global trade must balance. For every surplus, there is a deficit elsewhere. For decades, the United States has filled that role, running persistent trade deficits that absorb surpluses from China and other exporters. This has divided economists. Some argue surplus countries suppress consumption through limited social protections, restrained wage growth, or currency management. Others argue deficit countries create imbalances through chronic budget deficits and large capital inflows. Evidence points in both directions. Chinese wages have risen sharply over the past decade, and Beijing has expanded health insurance, pensions, and unemployment coverage. Consumption has grown, but not fast enough to absorb industrial output. At the same time, China has actively managed its currency. Allowing the yuan to weaken or remain undervalued has kept exports cheap and imports relatively expensive, reinforcing the surplus by shifting relative prices. Across the Pacific, the mirror image persists. The Trump administration, now back in office, is running large fiscal deficits while pressing allies and partners to invest in the United States and purchase U.S. debt. Those capital inflows finance America's trade deficit and sustain consumption beyond domestic production. This brings the focus to tariffs. If the United States imposed sweeping tariffs on Chinese goods, why didn't China's surplus collapse? Exports to the United States did fall. At the same time, exports to Europe, Southeast Asia, and much of the global South surged. On the surface, it appeared that China redirected goods once bound for American consumers. But trade data reveal another mechanism. Chinese goods are increasingly shipped to third countries, minimally processed or relabeled, and then exported onward to the United States under different tariff schedules. This exploits the bilateral structure of many U.S. tariffs. The evidence appears in American trade statistics. Once volatile categories such as pharmaceuticals and gold, which saw unusual pre-tariff stockpiling, are excluded, the overall U.S. trade deficit remains near record levels. The bilateral deficit with China has narrowed, but the total deficit has not. It has shifted. Honestly, this outcome was predictable. Bilateral tariffs are porous. Goods can be rerouted through third countries with relative ease. A universal tariff would be harder to evade and more likely to reduce the deficit, though at the cost of higher prices and broader disruption. Even then, supply chains adapt faster than policy frameworks. Another force has quietly reinforced the surplus. China's domestic slowdown has reduced import demand. Weakness in the property sector and cautious household spending have dampened appetite for foreign goods. External demand has substituted for internal softness. The inversion is stark. A slowing economy is expected to export less. China is exporting more, in part because domestic absorption has weakened. Critics argue this configuration cannot last. Large surpluses provoke backlash. European officials have raised concerns about Chinese overcapacity in electric vehicles and green technology. Trade defenses are spreading. The data so far suggest persistence. China has absorbed tariffs, navigated restrictions, and found new buyers. The United States has not meaningfully reduced its overall trade deficit. IMF projections indicate global imbalances will narrow only modestly over the coming years absent major policy shifts. The surplus feeds directly into global finance. Export earnings accumulate as foreign exchange reserves and outbound investment, influencing bond markets, currencies, and leverage. At ground level, the consequences are visible. European manufacturers face competition they struggle to match. Emerging markets benefit from cheaper inputs while risking industrial erosion. American consumers enjoy lower prices even as domestic producers warn of long-term damage. At the global level, the system is adjusting to an economy that supplies an outsized share of the world's goods, increasingly at the technological frontier. The unresolved question is not whether the surplus exists. It is how long the world can absorb it before adjustment arrives in a more disruptive form. The latest data do not signal reversal. They signal continuation at a scale that no longer fades into the background. Foreign exchange mechanics add another layer that, honestly, rarely makes headlines. When China runs a surplus of this magnitude, exporters do not simply convert dollars into yuan and spend them domestically. A significant share of those earnings is recycled through the banking system, ending up as foreign assets on balance sheets controlled or influenced by the state. This includes not only official reserves but policy bank lending and outward investment vehicles that operate outside the headline reserve figures. Analysts at the Financial Times have noted that this shadow reserve accumulation means China's external surplus translates into global financial influence far beyond what reserve data alone suggests. Capital controls amplify this effect. Unlike surplus countries such as Germany or Japan, China restricts how easily households and firms can move money abroad. That friction prevents surplus dollars from quickly translating into outbound consumer demand, locking more of the excess into institutional channels. The result is a surplus that feeds asset markets rather than consumption, reinforcing the imbalance instead of dissolving it. Another underappreciated driver is China's position in intermediate goods. A growing share of Chinese exports are not finished consumer products, but components embedded in supply chains elsewhere. Southeast Asian factories assembling electronics or European firms producing machinery increasingly rely on Chinese inputs. Even when final exports come from Vietnam, Mexico, or Eastern Europe, value-added trade data from the OECD show that China captures a rising share of the underlying export value. This allows Chinese surplus generation to persist even as final assembly migrates. Energy economics also matter. China has sharply reduced the import intensity of its growth. Massive domestic investment in renewables, nuclear power, and grid infrastructure has slowed the growth of fossil fuel imports relative to output. According to International Energy Agency data cited by Reuters, China's energy consumption is rising far more slowly than industrial output, lowering the import bill that would normally accompany manufacturing dominance. Meanwhile, demographics are exerting quiet pressure. An aging population tends to save more and spend less, especially in systems where retirement security is uncertain. China's median age has risen rapidly, and household surveys reported by the Wall Street Journal show precautionary saving remains elevated despite policy efforts to boost consumption. That demographic tilt structurally suppresses imports, while exports remain driven by corporate balance sheets rather than household demand. Trade policy responses abroad have also fragmented, rather than constrained, China's surplus. Anti-dumping duties, subsidies, and industrial policies in Europe and the United States often target specific sectors, not aggregate flows. Companies respond by shifting product mix and routing, not by reducing output. The surplus adapts sector by sector instead of shrinking overall. The feedback loop now runs in both directions. China's surplus weakens manufacturing elsewhere, reducing competitors' export capacity, which in turn increases reliance on Chinese imports. That dynamic has been observed in parts of Latin America and Africa, where local manufacturing output has stagnated even as trade volumes rise, according to World Bank development reports. The most destabilizing implication is temporal. Surpluses of this scale used to be transitional, associated with catch-up growth phases. China's has persisted well past that stage. As long as productivity gains outpace domestic absorption and capital controls limit adjustment, the surplus behaves less like a phase and more like a feature. The question is no longer whether the number is historically large. It is whether the global system has ever been tested by a surplus that is simultaneously this big, this persistent, and this financially integrated. Please like and subscribe. Leave your thoughts in the comments. Your support is appreciated. Thank you.